Hi, and welcome to our lesson on presentation skills. My name is Clark Imus, professor of EMS here at Kellogg Community College. Let's go ahead and get started to understand what we need to be able to grasp or what our goals will be at the end of this presentation when it comes to discussing presentation skills. There's 5 primary objectives that we're going to discuss as we go through this online lesson. The first is to be able to describe the 4 different instructional styles as outlined in the DOT 2002 guidelines. We'll describe the proper use of instructions and instructional presence within the classroom setting. We'll list the types of media that are available. Again, remember this was written back in 2002, so we're going to add some of the recent century to this information. But we'll also list criteria for successful classroom presentations and then strategies that you can use to augment your classroom presentations. We're also going to want to make sure we recognize the importance of different learning styles and how that we can use those within our lesson planning to be able to help meet the students where they're at. And anytime I think about presentation styles, there's 2 big aspects that come to mind first and foremost before we jump into the rest of the content, and that is a teacher-centered approach versus a student-centered approach. And you may have heard me use these terms often in our previous lectures. When you're talking about teacher-centered approach, you're talking about a example of direct instruction, a situation where you're going to be having an expert, a person, it's generally a more formal atmosphere, and it's a model that's designed for the teacher to be at the center of the education. They're there to just present their knowledge to the audience that's there. In essence, they're supposed to then be the sponge to absorb that information. And we know that in the realm of EMS, this is not typically a very successful approach, whether it's deployed very frequently or not. And typically it is deployed rather frequently in the EMS field. The more well-rounded approach is a student-centered approach. This is an approach that allows for the students to drive the inquiry, where they're able to, really at the essence, at the core, be able to begin the process of exploring their learning. And as an instructor, you fill a different role. Rather than being the one that provides the information directly to the students, being the dispenser of information, you now become a facilitator in their education, helping them achieve growth and work through difficult problems or difficult progress in those steps to have their higher order thinking reached. Oftentimes you'll see this as a personal model or as a delegator as well, where the individual is going to help establish the learning environment by, again, being much more involved with student individualized learning rather than being a projector of generic information or a static flow of information. Now, traditional lecture does have a place in education. It's probably one of the more common things that we would see. It's oftentimes referred to as face-to-face instruction. Again, you're going to see this most commonly in the classroom setting. Again, it's a very much so an instructor-centered technique or a teacher-directed technique. Again, you can see the image that's here that clearly outlines the difference between a learner-centered or a learner-directed or a teacher-centered or teacher-directed approach. You can see how passive learning, the retention of that content is going to be very minimum compared to when the students are the ones that are interacting and making decisions with the instructor as they progress through that lesson. We know that it works well for a standardized approach, especially if we're having guest lecturers come in. It's a nice way to be able to put someone up in front and allow for them to be able to discuss things in great detail with students. But again, it limits the amount of interaction, which limits the amount of retention you're going to see with your students. But again, being one of the most efficient ways to present, there is a time and a place for this. Oftentimes, students are going to give you feedback that these tend to be boring, and the students are easily disengaged with the material because of its lack of understanding. This typically works very poor for your kinesthetic learners, your typical learners that want to learn or experience by doing or by hands-on. And again, it's going to be best for typically your visual or your auditory learners who would prefer this style of instruction. And it breaks it down through a behavioralist approach, in essence, allowing for us to recognize that there's different aspects of behavior in the way we interact with our students. Last 2 things that I'd like to add to this would be there's a term that's used that says sage on the stage. This is where, because the expert is the one that's there, they're the ones that are going to have all of this focus, right? Again, they're the ones seen as the sage on the stage. And a lot of this has roots in Socratic and ancient philosophical methods, where there was storytelling and folks would gather around and there would be this verbal passing on of information, and that's how, in essence, traditional lecture originated. Now, the next aspect we look at is role playing, and role playing is a much more student-centered approach to learning. Scenarios or case studies, rehearsals, practice drills, whatever it might be, these are all good types of experiences for students to participate in, especially if we're looking at our kinesthetic learners. We also know that this is going to be good for students when they're developing their psychomotor skills, and we know that it's going to help them be able to identify higher ordered critical thinking skills. They're going to be able to progress up because they have to know what the next step is, especially if you're playing patient or playing victim or playing even as a bystander. Those things are going to require the students to have a more of a significant level of understanding or level of depth than you would otherwise by just skimming over something from a reading or providing in a lecture. A lot of these you're going to see they're going to may require some additional preparation time as you go to set these up, especially if you want to really have your scenario, your role playing, have some value to it in the form of realism. I would also make sure that you want the students to be able to actively participate in the learning process. And this is really awesome when you can put a role playing scenario in, but you have to find a way to engage the rest of the students that are in the room. If you have a class of 24, role-playing will be great for the small group of students that you're generally there with, but what about the rest of the students? What about the peanut gallery that's watching? What are you doing to engage them? I oftentimes like to use role-playing in class, especially when I'm trying to reinforce critical aspects of patient assessment or history gathering, or even building patient rapport. But I also have the members of the audience assess 5 things that they thought went very well and 5 things that they could have done, the group performing the scenario that could have done to improve upon. That's going to require them to be able to have some reflection. And when we get done, one of the things that we'll do is we'll go around and we'll talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly that went along with their scenario. But we allow students to provide that feedback. And once one piece of feedback is provided, we don't let the next student just keep repeating that same thing over and over and over. Well, they had BSI on, that was a good thing, and that's everybody says, right? Or they made it there safely. Well, no, there's got to be a level of depth to this as a form of instruction, so we don't allow for them to repeat that choice as it goes around the room, and that makes it more challenging for students, and they learn to think more critically during those scenarios when they're observing. Because they know that they're going to be put on the spot to outline information that was good or bad that they can't repeat from others. So they're trying to look for unique aspects, more detailed aspects. That's a nice addition when it comes to role playing. Again, it does use constructivist learning principles. That's one of the nice things. It allows for them to be able to construct these different aspects and build upon those aspects. And again, constructivism is where the student makes meaning in essence by experiencing things for themselves. And again, when you deploy this properly and you engage the students in a meaningful way, both those that are performing the role playing and those that are observing, it can make it for a very powerful learning experience. Now, when you're dealing with collaborative or informal learning, this is a strong, again, student-centered approach. It's great for team activities or open dialogue. I really like to use learning activities, or what most folks will call worksheets. I try not to call them worksheets in class because that kind of implies that there's a significant amount of work to them or that they can be burdensome. So I just try to call them handouts or activities that we're going to be able to do in class. But it's a great way for students to be able to work together collaboratively in a low-stress environment that's designed to help bolster communication and help bolster just the generic atmosphere of your learning environment. And I find that it's really nice, especially if you're trying to get people warmed up for something. Collaborative or informal learning is a way that you can kind of get them up to that level of engagement before you're throwing something new at them. It's also a great way to be able to review case studies or patient documentation or really any number of pre-learning assessments that you would want to do. And I'll talk about some of those approaches here in a little bit to supplement some of the additional material here from the DOT. Most of the time when you think about this collaborative learning style, again, it's going to use the constructivist learning principles where the instructor is going to be there to help guide as a coach. It does require you to monitor situations closely because, again, those that are can easily become less involved or less active generally will. And so you need to be there to help facilitate that process and motivate students to get that group collaboration together. And again, the point here is any type of informal or collaborative group activities where you're going to hear me use the term an exercise or an activity or a handout. You are there to guide and mentor the students and coach the students through that process, right? So it's a great way for you to be able to interact with them. But you can't limit yourself by passing out an assignment and sitting at the desk. You need to be up and engaging the students. Think about your classroom style when you're using these different approaches, your classroom setup. If I have a traditional lecture style setup, it's not going to be a very useful activity for me to have them work in groups when they can't physically work in groups together because of the room constraints. Groups in small tables, or if you have the ability to have chairs with wheels where they can wheel each around and make circles or move around to other groups, that's a great way that you can have some of that collaborative learning take place. And again, we don't want to let those passive learners just take over that situation from those that are more active. We need to make sure all folks are engaging in that, and that again comes down to your role as the coach. Now, the final one that we have is progressive, and this is more commonly going to be referred to as distance education. You may hear the term online education. You may hear the term learning management system or LMS thrown out there. Again, you got to recognize that this was written back in 2002 based off of a lot of information from the 90s. At any rate, there's still a lot of good truth to this, right? When you're thinking about the way in which you're going to interact with your student, folks oftentimes will teach the way that they were taught. And there's nothing wrong with having a traditionalist approach. But there are progressive aspects that we can look into. And in today's age, and with today's student, a student who has been immersed in technology since birth, who has been immersed in the use of the internet, since birth, individuals who have received what they want when they want it immediately without having to wait. That's created a little bit different expectations from our learners, both as adult and non-adult students. But I definitely think that we got to recognize that progressive learning has been around for a very long time. And in essence, it's just where learning takes place, where they're actually separate from the instructor and student are separate. Believe it or not, in the 1760s, there was examples where students were having to do writing samples and submit them back to their instructors and back and forth through correspondence for learning shorthand. That was one of the most first progressive classes that we've seen, even though we don't think of it very often of happening back that far ago. Now, it is going to have many different forms that are going to be possible when it comes to the media or the process that you're going to interact with students. Print and audio tape, videotape, satellite, those are some pretty old technologies. Print obviously is not that old, but that's going to look differently. Maybe we're going to use that in a form of an electronic file that the students are going to have to be able to access online through their online learning management system. Maybe it's watching a YouTube video you previously recorded, or an article, a peer-reviewed article from an online journal. Right? Those aspects are going to be there to be used for this style of progressive learning. The same principles don't always directly apply in an online environment. That does require a different level of instruction, a different level of engagement, sometimes even a higher level of engagement because of how passive that learning experience can be. We also know that there are synchronous and asynchronous style of distance learning as well. So your synchronous style would be an example of a Zoom class that meets weekly to augment online material, or maybe that is the material. Maybe it's just a distance lecture that you participate in and have regular class activities that correspond around that. That'd be an example of a synchronous, where you are meeting there at a very specific synchronized point of time where all the learners come together. Another example of distance education is asynchronous, and that's very similar to how we're interacting here with our online class, is that it's designed for you to be able to work at your own pace, on your own schedule for the most part, and to be able to give you the autonomy to work through the content in a fashion that works best for you and your environment. And so we have to recognize that the approaches that we use versus face-to-face versus distance education, whether it be role-playing or even a collaborative or informal activities, which again, all can happen in different learning modalities. We just have to think about how we actually interact with that. Again, the internet is a great tool for us to be able to use, but it's another slippery slope when it comes to borrowing or utilizing things we find in the internet without proper citations as well. That's very important for us in education. Now, again, I just want to kind of go back over this aspects of the teacher-centered versus the student-centered learning that it can occur. Now, we know that there is going to be major elements that will happen no matter what approach we use: knowledge, student participation, the role of the individual as a lecturer or the instructor itself, the role of the assignment we look to use, emphasis where it's placed, the assessment tools or methods we'll use, and then what type of culture, what type of academic culture is established within our environment. Now, a teacher-centered environment is transmitted from instruction. Knowledge is gained from direct instruction. It's generally passive in the way in which it's perceived. And then the role of the instructor is to play the leader or the authority figure that, again, is the sage on the stage. The emphasis oftentimes, or probably the role of the assessment, there's generally few tests, and it's only mainly for grading to see how much of that retention of material has occurred. We know that the emphasis is on learning only the correct answers, learning only the correct process, which oftentimes in learning, learning is really not a linear event. It's a lot of ups and downs, but in a teacher-centered, it's designed to progress only in a linear fashion. And then we also know that the assessment is going to be typically one-dimensional testing, right? We're just, again, assessing what cognitive knowledge do you have. And then your academic culture, it becomes competitive. It becomes based on the individualistic approach, where each person is for themselves to earn the highest grade that they can. You're kind of siloed. And again, that's not the real world. People generally don't just live in a bubble. They have to interact with others around them. And so if we look at a teachered, probably a student-centered approach, now we're talking about knowledge that's constructed by the students, where they have their hands into the content. They're arguing and discussing and making connections themselves amongst each other, rather than being passively absorbed just through the instructor. It's a form of active learning versus a form of passive learning. We know that the role of the instructor changes, right? In this case, you're expected to be a facilitator, to be a partner in the learning experience, one that helps them progress through that, rather than, again, being someone who's the expert, dragging people with your knowledge towards the finish line. We know that it's about developing a deeper understanding. We know that the role of assessments are going to be in many different forms, ways in which you're going to find where you're going to have ongoing feedback and continuations of assessments to show development of growth. The assessment methods are multidimensional because there's so many different ways that we can use different activities to be able to see how our students are performing within the different assessments we can use and putting forth in front of our students. And then the culture of the academic environment is going to be one that is collaborative and one that is supportive for success. Now, I want to talk to you briefly about some of the design principles that exist in curriculum development, because I always do think it's important, especially as you're looking at your lesson planning. We've talked about our learning environment, we've talked about our students' learning styles, and now we're getting ready to make the presentation. There's some key things that we really want to be able to break out. When we're making the actual presentation itself, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to introduce the subject matter very early on, and you're going to outline the flow of the course. You're going to go over what the requirements are for successful completion of the lesson and what is the desired outcomes from the course completion and what rules or regulations you have. But there's more to starting your presentation in a meaningful way than just introducing the content and talking about expectations. One of the areas that's important is making sure that you're prepared for the material you're going to present. And what I mean by this is that you need to make sure that you're prepared. Get there early. Make sure your equipment is in working order. Make sure that your lab supplies are available. Make sure that the technology that you plan to deploy works, that you have Wi-Fi if you're using it for your students, that again, you have a well-lit, well-invited space. Everything that you're going to need to have your presentation take off the way it needs to, that really is going to be determined based on your preparedness. Generally speaking, if you prepare for something in advance, you're going to be more apt to be able to focus on what you're doing rather than the setup and the takedown or all the other aspects that go along with teaching, right? Sometimes if we don't give ourselves enough time, it's hard to really switch gears from the setup of everything directly into the instruction. Sometimes you can lose those aspects. We also want to make sure that we're greeting the students as they arrive. Take time to get to know your students. Use their names. Spend a little bit of time greeting with them, talking with them about related experiences you may have had, ways in which you can professionally relate to the student that's going to help build that bond, that's going to make it easier for them to ask you difficult questions. It's going to make them more willing to be vulnerable and to be more willing to fail and learn from those mistakes with you when you create that environment. Again, make yourself available, right? Not just for class, not just for office hours, but again, around that as well. One of the statements that oftentimes I think is important to remember, and we don't really know who said this exactly, at least I don't, but students will not care how much you know until they know how much you care. We have this, belief in education that the more degrees and the more years of school you have, the more student debt you have, right, the smarter you are. And that's not really the case, because I could care less if someone's intelligent if they don't care for me. And it's when a student knows that I'm there to support them in their learning and that journey, it's because I'm going to be able to make a difference because I know that they know that I care. And so keep this in the back of your mind as you begin to make your presentations. Your students will not care how much you know until they know how much you care. Now, one of the other aspects we have is the appropriate use of barriers. You want to make sure that you don't use barriers in your classroom. And what I mean by barriers, I'm not talking about barriers like language barriers or things of that nature, but physical barriers like a desk or a podium, oftentimes. Think about where you are in relationship to your students. That's probably one of the most important things you can think of, right? You may feel more comfortable sitting at a desk or sitting behind a podium, but you're creating a barrier between you and your students, right? You want to, again, try to break down barriers, to be vulnerable yourself to mistakes, and to be able to contribute and have personal growth through the learning environment, through instruction, whether it's your instruction or through interaction with the students. But you're definitely going to want to make sure that you're conscious of those barriers. I'm a guy that likes to walk around the classroom. I feel like I speak and learn better, or deliver at least my content better, and my students would hopefully learn better, by being up and around. I also feel like that by being up and around, it creates a little bit more of a casual look, because when it comes to being formal or informal, so there are a time and a place. Doing a large presentation in a large auditorium, it should probably be a little more formal, versus if I'm working in groups and I'm working on collaborative learning, I may want to get down to eye level with the students, to work with them with where they're at. That's an important component that we look for as well. And then think about your body language, right? How do you appear to your students? Are you friendly? Are you approachable? Are you sitting there with your arms crossed and a furrowed brow, and you're going to keep people away at a distance? Maybe those are things that we want to try to avoid. Again, try to move around the room if you can. I think that it will serve you well, and it gives you a chance to work with classroom management to address any talkative students or unnecessary behaviors while in the classroom, to creating distractions. And again, you want to interact with your students. If you're not interacting with them, then you're only passively providing that information, right? Remember, if you're truly doing a student-centered approach, your goal should be to be a coach, to be a facilitator, to help improve and facilitate the growth of their learning. Now, when it comes to speaking in public, there's a couple key things to remember. Number one, be the professional. Be the individual that others are going to expect you to be in your role. Make sure you're using appropriate language, avoiding common terms of, sweetie or honey or dear or hun, whatever it might be, right? That's not very appropriate. It's not very professional when we're deploying those. We also don't want to be using any foul language or any obscenities within the room, especially even if you're amongst your peers. A lot of times we'll have this belief that, boy, we don't really have to worry too much. These are all my friends. But you do need to have that level of expectation that's going to set yourself apart from others, since you're the professional educator in the room. We also want to make sure that you are dressed appropriately, that you're speaking clearly and distinctly. We know that when you're using in a larger area, to be able to use audio recording equipment to help you amplify your voice if necessary, or for recording, those are all important. Remember that when you try to deploy humor in a classroom, a lot of times that humor may fall flat. And what I mean by that is it's a joke that folks may not think are funny. It may be jokes that some think are and others think are very inappropriate. You've got to use a lot of caution. And I would avoid using any type of degrading jokes, if you will, no matter who it is or for what it is. There's a time and a place, and that's generally not in the classroom. We don't want to use it for students to be able to point out their mistakes. We don't want to use it. Generally, if we do use it, we want to use it sparingly, and it better be pretty corny. Those are things that you just have to be careful when it comes to that. And it should be related to the subject matter, right? Again, the goal of this is not going to be able to just use catchy and colorful phrases, because the last thing we want to do is put down another person or group. Jargon's another one we want to avoid. Again, if we're using a lot of jargon, we're going to have a lot of folks that may not understand what we're saying, and we may lose some of the context of the information we're providing in translations. We also want to make sure that when we're holding eye contact, that we do as much as we can, but we also want to not only just stare at one, we don't want to stare at one person the whole day, and you don't want to just not look at them ever, but kind of maintain eye contact and kind of move yourself around the room, but don't be afraid to make eye contact with your students. I wouldn't hold a gaze for too long, and then just watch for personal blind spots that may exist as part of that as well too. Just because, again, another one is if they're not necessarily even taking notes, and you notice that, don't just assume that they're just not learning, right? They may be clearly listening to you using a different learning preference. Now, the way you look is important as well too, right? We talked about this. Dress appropriately. Oftentimes we're going to use a uniform. You need to make sure you talk to your primary instructor or program director about what is appropriate. Sportswear is generally appropriate for classroom presentations. It's not something that I am one that's going to say, hey, I think you should be wearing tennis shoes and things of that nature. Think about what you're going to be doing in class. And remember, if you require your students to be in a uniform, you should probably be in a form of a uniform yourself. Again, we want to practice like you're going to perform in the field. That's the idea behind it there. Make sure that you're well rested, right? If you don't have enough sleep, it's going to affect your humor, it's going to affect your attitude, your demeanor, it's going to affect your judgment. All those things are playing a role. Don't plan to walk off the truck right from the ambulance right into the classroom without any preparation. That is not what a teacher should do. You need to make sure that you're prepared. Rest is part of it. Looking the part is part of it. And then being prepared for the material is important as well too. When you're around students, be conscious of their personal space. Be conscious of the way you interact with them, whether if it's appropriate physical contact or inappropriate contact. Well, I would hope you're not doing inappropriate contact, but the idea behind it is just don't touch if it's not necessary, right? Treat all students equally. Engage the students equally. Avoid bias as much as we can. Be conscious of bias. Avoid any aspect of bias we might have when it comes to dialogue or practicing exercises, right? We want to try to be as neutral as we can because it doesn't really have an impact on the learning. Avoid picking favorites and don't pass judgment on to students, right? You can easily decide a student who is sitting with their eyes closed is sleeping, but they may really be concentrating on what you're saying. They may be trying so hard to concentrate on what you're saying that they're trying to keep their eyes closed to be able to hear what you're saying, to absorb it. Just because a student may appear to be taking notes does not mean that they're paying attention. They may be writing a letter or doing something else unrelated. Same thing goes when they're on their laptops, right? You're like, oh, I'm following along in the PowerPoint. Sure. Meanwhile, they've got their work shift up and they're picking up shifts or clinical shifts or working on something else related to coursework, but not actively paying attention. So remember that it does go both ways. So be careful how we pass judgment on to our students. Now, the use of audiovisual equipment is an area that you can either make or break when it comes to your instruction. If you are only prepared to use your PowerPoint and you have no other backup plan, then when, if and when technology goes bad, you're not going to necessarily have a plan of attack that's going to be very easy for you to punt with, right? You're going to have to be comfortable enough with your material that you're not going to be excessively reliant on audiovisual equipment. Have a backup plan. That's probably one of the most important things I can tell you, right? Know your equipment ahead of time, make sure it works the way you expect to deploy it, and then have a backup plan for when it doesn't work out right. I spent a lot of time going around to different fire stations doing a number of different continuing education classes offsite. And these are old fire stations, right? They didn't have internet at the time. They didn't have projectors or they had nothing. Everything that you needed, you had to bring with you. I had my own projector. I had my own backdrop. I had my own computer, laptop, printer I'd bring with me, along with all the other equipment, right? I was printing out cheat sheets right when I was there. And this was in the early 2000s. Well, I wouldn't say about 2010 or so. But it wasn't something that was very common for folks to just have access to the internet then, right? So you had to have a backup plan. If your presentation went out, if my flash drive went corrupt, I have to have a backup plan to be able to continue to offer that same level of instruction, even though I may have to alter my lesson plan. The more comfortable you are with your content, the easier it will be to have a backup plan. It'll be easier for you over time to be able to tweak your lesson plans. Early on, you're going to probably be more heavily dependent on that than you will as you become a more seasoned instructor. Think about your writing surfaces. Think about what you have to write with. You got a whiteboard, great. Is there dry erase markers? No, because trust me, it really sucks when you realize you're using a permanent marker on a whiteboard. Key behind to get that off, though, if you ever do that, all you have to do is take dry erase marker and draw over the permanent marker, and it generally comes right up. Crazy enough. But think about your writing surfaces, right? Do you have them there? Flip charts, poster boards, handouts. Do you have enough material to do what you expect to do, right? If you're going to do group work, do you have enough material for your folks to be into small groups? If you're doing board work, and I'll tell you, when I talk about board work, I'm talking about how well you write on the whiteboard for a presentation. Sometimes I have a real bad problem with this because number one, I have bad handwriting, and I'm not the world's greatest speller. And so because of those two things, I have oftentimes stayed away from doing board work. Where other instructors who have nice handwriting or can easily spell, they would sometimes maybe gravitate towards that. I found that I was gravitating more towards other forms of equipment, things like PowerPoints, until I realized, wow, I'm really only giving him one fashion of something, and I need to be able to come up with something on the fly to help a student grasp content, because maybe they're just not getting that material that I'm presenting through the images or the graphics that I'm displaying. So you'll learn that there's certain things that you can augment to use your whiteboards. But when you're doing these drawings on the board, right, the worst thing you could do is look at your students, hear what they have to say, and then turn to the whiteboard and start talking to the whiteboard, because now they're not going to be able to hear you. Your voice is going to have to reflect off the whiteboard and back out to the classroom. It's important that as you write, that you try to, again, be able to project backwards to be able to let your students know what's going on, and that you're also able to make sure you can step out of the way to display your work in a meaningful fashion. Another thing that's really cool for students now is having them take pictures, right? Before you erase something, make sure everybody's got your notes, but folks can easily take a snapshot of the screen, and you can really use that later on. If you're using other forms of writing displays, whether maybe you're casting or sharing your screen and you're using a writing applet on a tablet or computer, again, you can save those, and the students do like to have that work notes that you may have from board work. Again, be conscious of how you do your board work. Be conscious of how you, the coloring aspects, something that's too light, oftentimes can't be seen. Those things do make a difference. Now we're going to take a history trip here, down to overhead projectors. I don't know if portable overhead projectors are very portable today, but most of your actual projectors that you would see, your overhead projectors, are typically digital now. You're going to be able to have some type of camera to be able to share what you're looking at, like a dot camera is a more common one you might see on a desk nowadays. You may also, again, have a computer that you interact and can share whatever is on your desktop screen directly with that as well too. Screencasting is another really cool tool that can be done from a tablet. It just requires a different technology within the classroom. So if you plan to use a piece of technology like a piece of software from an iPad, make sure you can toss that to the screen. If you're going to be doing any number of drawing or writing on a flat surface, make sure you've got some type of vertical dot cam or GoPro or whatever it might be. Or again, if you're going to be writing on a screen, something that's going to properly be able to capture that, to be able to share. Remember, no matter what you're doing, again, it's really nice if you can use more color. It's also really nice if you have better handwriting. Again, remember, just writing stuff out is great, but if you don't have enough information there, it can be difficult for them to grasp. I'll give you an example. I decided to try another method of instruction where instead of doing PowerPoints, this was after I tried doing scenario-based learning only, I tried to do a different level of presentations, and some PowerPoints I did and some PowerPoints I did not use, but I would use the content and I would write them out on a blank sheet of paper, and I'd have a dot cam to look down over me, and I would write it out, and I would use this to demonstrate how to take proper notes. I did this over the respiratory section, so we're talking a lot about rate and volumes and calculations, things that would be helpful when it comes to taking notes. I'd use that as an example to show students. Again, I wouldn't do it for every lesson, but there's a time and a place for that. It could be a little bit slower as well too, because sometimes it takes longer to write things out by hand. A slide projector. If you can find a slide projector with a good bulb at a garage sale, I think you're doing pretty good. Slideshows like PowerPoint are what we currently use, right? There's a whole lot of new tech that gets out there. This is like a video projector, except it's a single slide. So it's a still pick. And this was great for, early on when we were teaching EMS. I know some instructors didn't want to get rid of their wonderful clickers that they'd have that would shuffle through their slides. But photography was a really important aspect for education because it was a way we could capture real-life images and display them in the classroom. Now it's the internet, and everything has got pictures because of every device has a camera on it. It's a much different environment now than what it used to be when it came to gathering that type of presentation material. Copyright now is your biggest concern. You got to be really conscious of where you're taking images from and who you're giving proper credit to. Now that takes us to digital and computer technology devices. Again, anytime we're talking about technology is expensive, but the more it's deployed, the cheaper it gets over the time, right? I remember when flash drives were outrageously expensive, and now I really feel like flash drives today are almost obsolete with the use of OneDrive or Dropbox or OneNote, whatever these, it's online storages. Now that's the cloud storage. That's where it's at right now. So technology is going to have an impact in education as we look through the 21st century. Again, the technology you use is going to depend on the way in which you plan to instruct. The more interactive technology you have, again, you got to prepare for pitfalls when it comes to presenting your information. It can be a really great way, or it can be a really negative way of trying to get your point across. If you're too focused on the tech side of things, you can lose the learning. An example is in simulation. When our simulation lab here at KCC was nearing its end of its life, this was probably in 2018, just before we had the COVID pandemic. There was constant failures in the technology, constant failures with the mannequins, constant failure with the audio-visual recordings. It was very difficult for us to try to do those things, and then to be able to deploy the resources that we intended to use, the way our curriculum was set up. It led to a lot of delays in instruction, where students were sitting around waiting for us to problem solve technology. That's something you got to recognize. That is a big downside to the use of technology. Is when it goes down, sometimes it goes down big, and you're going to have to come up with other alternative ways to be able to instruct. And technology does have an end of life span, right? It doesn't last for forever. If you're going to invest in something early on, you need to make sure that you also have a way of sustaining that level of technology as your course and instruction progresses. We also have to make sure that we've got compatibility, that if we're requiring students to use something, that it works within other devices. PDFs are a really nice tool for the internet, right? Most computers and tablets, phones will all be able to read a PDF, but not every device can always read a different format. So we got to be careful on some of those aspects. CDs and DVDs. Now, I'm a big fan of showing videos in class. I'm not one that likes to put the video in and then kick my feet back and just leave it be. But I do like to use YouTube videos for detailed level of instruction, where I need to be able to give a good overview in a very short period of time to try to activate some previous content in my students so that I can make some new connections. I'm a big fan of Khan Academy. I'm a big fan of any of anatomy and physiology video style interactive short videos for a quick overview. Those are really nice to be able to use. And then again, there are certain times where there's great DVDs that we've been able to use. I think of, for the longest time, the Emergency Response Guidebook, the ERG. We would play that old DVD. Before that, it was a VHS tape. And even some of the best videos that I've seen for issues with trauma and things of that nature were from a long time ago, from the late 90s, on a VHS tape that was converted over. There's a place for that level of technology. Realistically, you're going to have it in different forms now. You'll have DVDs still for your American Heart and maybe some of your other certification classes. A lot of times now you're using flash drives or online streaming to be able to access that technology. And so that's a really unique way of being able to do that. Again, you don't even have a situation where you can buy a laptop that has a CD-ROM anymore. I mean, that's something that's now not necessary. Internet. Internet's great, but the internet has to be there. And if you're relying solely on the internet for class and you lose it, that can be a big problem. One of the things that you think of oftentimes is distance learning, where you're going to be using one instructor at one location, projecting out live to other campuses or other locations where students can participate. If you lose that live stream, that other campus automatically loses their instructor. You got to think of a backup plan. Who's going to be at that facility that could easily pop right back out and immediately pick up where you left off? That's not always going to happen. We also have to think about the speed of technology, right? If you're working with students in a low-income area or an area that doesn't have access to high-speed internet, it can be a big challenge for them to be able to accomplish simple tasks that other students may be able to do very easily, such as watching a video or downloading a handout, right? That may not be able to do. Another one we look at is for those who are hearing or visually impaired. How are we going to make sure that we're preparing to interact with those folks? Do we offer closed captioning for our online videos if we have those? Do we offer a screen reader available for those who are sight impaired? Do you make pre-recordings of your sessions that you allow students to watch ahead of time? Or do you allow students to record you while you're in class? Again, when you do these things and you think about these aspects of technology, It's going to give you a lot more tools to deploy to your students, to give them more options, to vary the way that they learn based on maybe their learning preferences or modalities, but also ways in which that you can try to build that meaningful connection to them. So I think that's going to help create that or instill that core content for the knowledge that we're looking at. Now, we also want to make sure we're gauging student responses. One of the things that I oftentimes will really think about is, what are my students doing while I'm talking, right? You're going to have to get to the place or space where you can be speaking naturally while still observing your students to see what's going on. You can't just blank out because you're lecturing, right, and not pay attention to what your students are doing. That becomes a little bit crazy in that case. But what do you see? What is your understanding of how they're getting that information? Try to use clues to tell you if a student's struggling to follow the presentation. Have you lost their motivation, right? You recognize that at first they're engaged, and all of a sudden no longer they're engaged, they're twiddling their pens, they're messing with their hair, they're staring out the window, right? Those are things that are going to tell you something is not going well with your presentation, and there's a good need for a mid-flight correction to re-engage those students. Now, if you detect a problem, you may be able to move students around if you have talkative students. You may be able to get those that need to be closer to you or further away, kind of have a little bit of a separation to do there, right? But there's some other barriers that you want to think about when it comes to students and their response. Number one is when you're speaking to a group, can they understand you? Are they non-English speakers? And if that's the case, is there something that we can do? Maybe speak slower, and I'm not meaning like speak slow, like as they don't understand. That would be offensive. But I'm a fast talker, and I've been told that some of the ways that I can help be a better presenter of content is to slow down when I'm speaking and pronunciate my words, because that makes it easier for some folks who are non-English speakers. Maybe for those that are hearing impaired, do we have audio devices that can help them? Is there an interpreter that's present? One of the things that it's really cool here for KCC is we now have started to make sure we have a sign language interpreter at our EMS pinning ceremonies, at our graduation ceremonies, because everyone should be able to partake in the celebration, regardless if you can hear or not. Sight impaired, and then other disabilities that are always possible, right? Think about your students and try to gauge that. But I also want to be able to gauge the level of interaction that I'm having. Are the students paying attention? Are they taking notes? Are they trying to process information? Can you see their gears turning, right? Those things are going to be helpful to us. Now, when we're designing our lesson plans, we really want to try to make sure the needs of our students are met by varying the styles of learning that we're going to interact with, right? Students have a variety of learning styles and preferences. We know that. We know that educational psychologies are characterized or categorized by describing models of thinking. We know that it has to do with how they process their thoughts and the students' individual preferences for how they learn. So as you're going through this and you get done with a lesson, or you're in a lesson even for that matter, think about the way you teach and how effective it is. One of the people who had a big influence on my life and how I instruct told me once that if you create something, a presentation, something for educational purposes, let's say, and you're really proud of it, and you do it once and it's good, and then you take and you stick it on the shelf and you don't do anything with it and you pull it back off and you keep doing that same presentation over and over again, it's going to lose its value. No matter how great the content is, it's going to lose its value over time. You've got to continuously tweak your lessons, right? That's one of the big parts of it here is you need to reevaluate what you're doing, because sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. If you keep telling the same jokes to your students, you're going to find that over the years, your jokes aren't going to make sense because the age demographic of the students are going to change. same thing goes with the way in which you interact with them. If you expect to pull out a VHS tape, well, it may wow them actually because they may not know what it is. But if you pull out something old like that, right, you could lose them because they're going to go, this is so old. This has no relevance, no meaning to me. Keep your stuff up to date, right? Try to find new ways of pulling things from other instructors, right? When you observe another instructor teach, whether it be at a conference or a colleague or just watching someone online, whatever it might be, think about that. Reflect on their performance and how it made you feel and how engaged and that you were as a learner during that time. And then try to use those pieces and parts to improve your teaching the next time that you instruct, the next time that you present. That will definitely help you be able to kind of reframe some of that. Again, your lesson plan should create a framework that aligns not only with the content, the lecture material that you're presenting, but also the learning modalities for the students, right? We want to try to vary that. We want to recognize that we are going to have an impact on knowledge and on their affect and their psychomotor skills, but how do we climb them from lower order thinking into higher order thinking? I'm a big fan of case studies. Case studies are a great way to be able to do a really easy breakdown of in-depth collaboration. Again, you can incorporate a lot of different multimedia for this. I've seen case studies where it is involving 911 dispatch recordings, photos, videos, even folks that were present who come in and do either a recording, like a recalling of their own accounts, or where they come in and they tell a story, right, as part of a case study. That's very important as well, too. It can be presented to individuals or to groups of students. I'm a real big fan of video case studies, and I'm a real big fan of video case studies that aren't the greatest, because I feel like that brings a lot more value. If you have something that's completely perfect from stem to stern, it's not as valuable as something that we can pick apart, something that we can go ahead and see the value of good and bad in certain cases. And so I would encourage you to come up with case studies, whether they're tabletop case studies, whether they are the form of focus on an individualized skill, like a patient assessment, or if you're doing more complex systems where you're dealing with an MCI, multiple agencies, multiple entities, all those things play a role. Scenarios, another one's a great place for you to get some hands-on practice where the students can simulate being the practitioner. Scenarios are going to work best when they are pre-planned by the instructor. Almost all of our instructors, I love to give them things that were given to me. I've got a couple of different scenario playbooks. They're just pre-established scenarios. They're old. I'm not going to say they're brand new. But you know what? The history and the setup for most scenarios works, no matter how old they are. So something to kind of think about when it comes to that. And then discuss with the students the ground rules of your expectations, right? Where professionalism should start and end. And then what also can be done if you're doing small group discussions is you can also have them write down, or you can have them present stuff back to the larger group. Simulations, I'm a fan of simulations, right? I love the idea of victims and moulage and equipment all role play in the scenarios. It does take quite a bit of time, but we also want to make sure that if we're going to have students there and they're observing, that they are engaged. And we cannot reiterate the importance of debriefing, because you know what? Simulations are great, scenarios are great, but that's not where the learning occurs. The learning occurs is when you reorganize or you unpack that, you prioritize, you sequence that back to content, and then again, the students should be able to walk away with not only what they did, but what they could have done differently, or what other options they would have had to deploy. That's really important, right? And again, this takes a lot of time and a lot of prepping to be able to get that done. When we do a 4-hour simulation with 2 scenarios, we require an instructor, 2 instructors, to be there. In case, again, we need to be able to punt or come up with a backup plan. We've got 2 people to do it. And then we also pay them an entire extra hour of instruction just to set up and take down the lab, because there is so much equipment in a simulation to set up. And we've got a beautiful facility where you turn it on and go, but you still have to do moulage and set up and make sure, again, your technology is working the way it's supposed to. Personal stories, yeah, sometimes they're called war stories. You got to be careful with war stories, guys. They can help students, right? They even say it can help students develop concrete cognitive images or subject matter, But at the end of the day, if all you're doing is telling stories, you're not necessarily relating it back to the core content that we need to, right? Why are you telling the story? If you have a purpose to the story, if there's a connection back to the content you're instructing, that's great. If it's just to tell them about a time that you had a really bad call and you did really great, being a teacher is not the spot to pat yourself on the back. You got to allow students to disagree, right? But we got to make sure that it's done so in a way that's going to be purposeful. Okay? You cannot allow students to disagree into non-purposeful discussion, which means, and I'm bad at this because I squirrel quite a bit, right? I got a plan. If someone says something, I'm off onto another track. You got to be able to keep yourself back in target, get back on track where you can. Don't just fall off the wagon to fall off the wagon, right? Things have to have a purpose, and there has to be a progression to your lesson. Again, it can sow the seeds for some great discussion points and some opportunities, but you have to know when to employ them because they should enhance what you're talking about, not detract from it. Games and entertainment, you're going to find that there's a lot of games that you can use out there. A lot of really cool stuff. Quizlet is out there. Kahoot is out there. I would encourage you to check out some of these links. Kahoot's great for creating interactive quiz style games. I think that's a really nice way to do in class to measure learning along the way to get a good formative evaluation of the progression of learning that's taking place in front of you in real time. Quizlet's another one I like to use, especially this is great for informal or small group work. And even things like Quizlet now has embedded AI, where it now can help teach students, test them on flashcards. There's a lot of really cool ways that they can interact with that. YouTube. There's so many things on YouTube. There are so many things that are incorrect on YouTube. You got to be conscious of what materials you use when it comes to entertainment online. But long story short, with adult learners, they enjoy games. They really do, right? But they have to have relevancy to the course. Jeopardy is a big one I like to do. I've set it up to do Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, where they play, and we test that out over a period of weeks to see how well they do for that, or even for continuing ed. That's a great way. But it has to have a structure that gives back to the students in the form of learning, right? It can't just be fun for the fun of it. We also want to make sure that we think about how it provides breaks from the routine typical lessons we provide, right? So if we're really oftentimes in a situation where we've been passively providing information to students for so long, because again, it was the method that was most practical or the method that was chosen for us to use, this gives them a break away from that monotonous routine. And oftentimes it can even re-energize them, right? And for some, they love it. They love this idea of being able to get into a competitive situation, right? And then there are some students that just don't like that at all. And you're going to have to, whether it's Quiz Bowl or whether it's any type of game, you just have to make sure that you are conscious that it will work for some and not for others. And it's going to have an impact on how you deploy those. Now, the last thing that I want to show you here is going to be talking about some of the instructional design process that you'd see when creating a lesson. One of the ways in which you can have a big impact on your presentation is by understanding the instructional design process a little bit more. I'm going to take us to a little bit more of some content and some depth for our presentations as we kind of look to extract some useful tools other than be prepared and know your content. One of the big things that you're going to look at here when it comes to your instructional design is going to be the ADDIE model. This refers to analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. And this is that process of thinking about how you would perform your presentation from the beginning all the way kind of through the end. It's that instructional design process model. The analysis is going to be of your situation to understand any gaps that you need to fill in. So as you're starting to think about what you're doing, you've got to start to this. Do you have any gaps that you may need to fill in? When we think about your design, it's based on your analysis. You make informed decisions to design the best possible learning experience you can for your students. From there, you develop your content. You bring your learning experiences to life by building your end product, by framing that out. You then go through your implementation, where you're going to distribute your learning end product to your audience. So you actually distribute that, you go ahead and you present that to your audience, and then you evaluate. You evaluate to see if learning occurred. If your learning end product is effective, if you need to make any necessary updates or changes, in that case, you cycle back to the analysis, design, development, implementation, and then continuously going back and forth through those models.